Mountbatten's relationship with the Queen was a complex one. She had known him since she was a child. He had become a father figure to her after the death of her own father, when she was in her 20s, and she regularly went to stay at Broadlands. She was fond of her husband's uncle, but she had no illusions about him and how he used her to further his own ends. A standing joke in royal circles and army circles was how quickly he would make reference to "my niece, the Queen," often using her as an excuse for being late. According to her private secretary, the Queen's attitude was that he was her Uncle Dickie, and she was very, very fond of him, but sometimes she wished he'd shut up. Once she said, "I always say yes, 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 yes to Dickie, but I don't listen to him." Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Denise, and today we're going to keep going in the Mountbattens. Now, in this chapter, we are going to be talking about how Dickie was, he was a fixer, and he had his hands in all sorts of nefarious little things, but he was really good at getting people to believe he had nothing to do with it, and that if you heard his name mixed up in that, you're mistaken. But then later, things would come out that would cast all kinds of doubt on his assertions and his insistence that he had nothing to do with this dark, shadowy part of the government. Dickie's life is going to forever be the cold case that never gets solved, because he was very good, it seems, at covering his tracks. So this chapter raises a number of different questions as to his involvement in certain uglier parts of the government, including what would appear to be a coup. And then towards the end of this chapter, we get into his relationship with Prince Charles, at the time Prince Charles, and that's really interesting. Also his involvement in the estate of Edward VIII after Edward's passing, and how, according to Wallace, Mountbatten sort of ransacked the house and just took back things that he felt that the royal family ought to have back. And that's a perfect example of the sorts of things that he would do. And he would have a very good reason why he needed to do it. Well, I was protecting her correspondence. I was protecting the royal family. There was things out there that, shouldn't get out. I was helping. No. I didn't have anything. I wasn't doing anything wrong. This was definitely not for me. I mean, my goodness, what a hassle it was. I definitely didn't do it for myself. No. My motivation was completely and totally for the betterment and for the preservation of the royal family. So he always had these great sounding reasons for what he was doing. But anyway, I, again, am going to read this mostly without too much interjection, particularly the beginning of the chapter, because we're going to be talking about the overthrowing of the government and how they tried to rope him into it and how they tried to get him to back and support this change of government. And I don't understand British politics enough to be of any worth in side commentary. So I will reserve my comments for later in the chapter when we get to things that my, poor mind can understand. Okay, this is chapter 26. It's entitled Fixer. It says that in August 1967, Cecil King, chairman of International Publishing Corporation, confided in his diary, quote, "Cudlip had some talk a few weeks ago with Mountbatten at some dinner. Hugh asked him if it had been suggested to him that our present style of government might be in for a change. He said it had. Hugh then asked if it had been suggested that he might have some part to play in such a regime. Mountbatten said it had been suggested, but that he was far too old, 67, I think." Here was the first references to one of the most mysterious and controversial episodes in Mountbatten's life. Harold Wilson's government, which had been in power since 1964, had been beset with economic problems and industrial unrest. There were concerns with cuts in the armed forces, a belief that public spending needed to be reduced to help interest rates, and tougher laws needed against the trade unions. Adding to this, in 1964, Jim Angleton, the head of the CIA's counterintelligence division, had told MI5, Britain's domestic security service, that according to a secret source, which he would not divulge, Wilson was a Soviet agent. The case would henceforth become known under the code name Oat Chief. Whatever the merits of the accusation, it was certainly true that there was extensive Soviet penetration of the Labour Party. Various defectors had named a series of Labour MPs and trade unionists, including Joseph Kagan, a close friend of Wilson's. For months, Cecil King had publicly been saying that Wilson should be replaced by a coalition government, and on 23rd April he had dined with Oswald Mosley in Paris to sound him out as a possible leader of a national government. His other possible candidate was Mountbatten, and an opportunity soon presented itself for further discussion. On Saturday, 27th April, Edward Pickering, chairman of the Daily Mirror, was Mountbatten's guest at the annual reunion of the Burma Star Association at the Albert Hall. The Mirror helped with advertising for the event, and Mountbatten took the opportunity of discussing with him his concerns about, quote, the developing national crisis of strikes and economic problems. He asked if he could meet Hugh Cudlip, the paper's editorial director. On the following Monday morning, Cudlip, who had been sailing in the Solent at the weekend, saw Mountbatten at Broadlands en route to London, noting in a memo to himself afterward Mountbatten's concerns. Quote, important people, leaders of industry and others, approached me increasingly, saying something must be done, Mountbatten said. Of course, I agree that we can't go on like this. But I'm 67, and I'm a relative of the Queen. My usefulness is limited. This is a job for younger men, and obviously talent and administrative ability, which does not exist in Parliament, must be harnessed. Perhaps there should be something like the emergency committee I ran in India. Cudlip told his host that Cecil King shared his views. The crux of the problem was that the nation had lost faith in Mr. Wilson and the Socialists, and still had no idea in Mr. Heath and the Tories. And still had no faith in Mr. Heath and the Tories, said Cudlip. The head of a coalition government, whatever it may be called, would have to be a Labour minister. He suggested Roy Jenkins, or Dennis Healey, and Mountbatten expressed his preference for the former, adding, I certainly don't want to appear to be advocating or supporting any notion of right-wing dictatorship or any nonsense of that sort, nor do I want to be involved at my age. But, like some other people, I am deeply concerned about the future of the country. They agreed to meet the following week at Mountbatten's London house with King, and at the suggestion of Dicky, Solly Zuckerman, whom he described as now utterly disenchanted with Harold. The four duly met at Kinnerton Street at 4:30 p.m. on the afternoon of May 8th. According to Cudlip, King had outlined his concerns about Wilson's government and the need for action, and asked Mountbatten if he would, quote, agree to the titular head of a new administration in such circumstances. Mountbatten turned to his friend. Solly, he said, you haven't said a word so far. What do you think of all this? Sir Solly rose, walked to the door, opened it, and then made this statement. This is rank treachery. All this talk of machine guns at street corners is appalling. I am a public servant, and I will have nothing to do with it. Nor should you, Dicky. Mountbatten expressed his agreement, and Sir Solly departed. Only a minute or two elapsed between Zuckerman's departure and King's. Lord Mountbatten was, as always in my experience, courteous but firm. He explained explicitly, but briefly, that he entirely agreed with Solly, and that sort of role, so far as he was concerned, was simply not on. That night Mountbatten wrote in his diary, drove back with Solly and Graham's car from Lincoln's Inn, where we had dinner, to 39 Montpelier Walk, to discuss with John and Patricia, meeting which Solly and I had with Cecil King and Hugh Cudlip. Dangerous nonsense. 36 hours after the Kinnerton Street debacle, and with Labour routed to the local elections, King published, Enough is enough, a front-page article in the Daily Mirror calling on Harold Wilson to step down as Prime Minister after his mishandling of the British economy. King blamed both Tory and Labour governments for Britain's failure to make the same post-war recovery as other nations, notably the defeated Japanese, Germans, and Italians, and he called on Wilson to resign. But the fallout from his provocative headline had unintended consequences. It was King, not Wilson, who was forced to resign. The man who took his place as chairman of IPC was Hugh Cudlip. 2 years later, King returned to the issue. In July 1970, he wrote to Dicky, You may recall that about 3 years ago you asked me to come and see you. Since then, events have moved, though slowly. I wonder if it would be helpful if I were to call on you at your convenience and continue our conversation. Dicky replied, I well recall our meeting, but you will remember that at the end I definitely came to the conclusion that there was nothing I could do to help in this matter. I'm afraid my views are unaltered. To Solly, Dicky wrote the same day, enclosing his reply, adding, As you can imagine, the last thing I want to do is to continue any conversation with him. That might well have been the end of the matter, but for the fact that Cudlip decided to refer to the episode in his memoirs. In November 1975, he therefore sent a draft of his recollection to Dicky. He wrote, I have told the story of the meeting with you in a way in which it can do no possible harm to you and Solly. If you would like me to add anything, please be kind enough to tell me, and I will not approach Solly until you and I have agreed on what I say about you. But I will not, of course, mention Solly without his agreement. Mountbatten replied 2 days later, "Your description of the interview is incomplete and inaccurate. I have discussed this with Solly and my private secretary, John Barrett, who was coming down from his office and had reached the landing next to my sitting room when he heard Solly make this statement. All three of us agree that Solly said words to this effect. This is rank treachery. All this talk of machine guns at street corners is appalling. I am a public servant and will have nothing to do with it, nor should you, Dickie." I expressed my agreement with him, and then he left, and not more than a minute or two elapsed between Solly's departure and yours. I was merely courteous and explained explicitly and briefly that I entirely agreed with Solly, and that sort of role, as far as I was concerned, was simply not on. Cudlip's book was published in October 1976 and serialized in The Observer. It created a media storm. "There are various inaccuracies with which I will not bore you," wrote King to Cudlip on reading the book, "but the interview with Mountbatten, at which I was present, had no resemblance to the one described in your book. The plans and ambitions attributed to me at the end of my time at the Mirror are primarily fanciful." Suspicions of a planned coup refused to go away. On 29 March 1981, a story about the coup appeared in the Sunday Times. The following day, Zuckerman was interviewed on the Today program. King responded a few days later by releasing his diary entry for the May 1968 meeting, which gave a rather different account of the meeting. And King's diary read this way: "Hugh and I called on Dickie Mountbatten at his request at his flat at 4:30. He insisted that Solly Zuckerman should be there. Dickie spoke of him as a man of invincible integrity and as one of the greatest brains in the world. Solly seemed embarrassed by this and hurried away as soon as he decently could. Dickie does not really have his ear to the ground or understand politics. After Solly had gone, Mountbatten said that he had been lunching at the Horse Guards and that morale in the armed forces had never been so low. He said that the Queen was receiving an unprecedented number of petitions, all of which have to be passed on to the Home Office. According to Dickie, she is desperately worried over the whole situation. He's obviously close to her and is spending this weekend at Broadlands. He asked if I thought there was anything that he should do. My theme was that there might be a stage in the future when the Crown would have to intervene. There might be a stage when the armed forces were important. Dickie should keep himself out of public view so as to have clean hands if either emergency should arise in the future. He has no wish to intervene anyway." Cecil King said that he had withheld this note from his published diary on the grounds that it was confidential, especially the part about the Queen. It was beginning to emerge that Mountbatten had shown far more interest than he or the others had earlier admitted. In November 1975, whilst those involved had been straightening out their versions of events, Zuckerman had added a diary note to his file on the episode. "All I hope is that Dickie did not go beyond what we agreed. The fact of the matter is, as Hugh Cudlip knows only too well, that Dickie was really intrigued by Cecil King's suggestion that he should become the boss man of a government. When I saw Dickie at Prince Philip's dinner party on the 17th November, 3 nights after I started to dictate this note, he seemed very pleased with himself and thought the whole matter was settled, once again implying that his record of what had happened in an event would be the statement which history would accept. In fact, Dickie in 1968 had put forward various names who might be, quote, useful for such a national government, including Zuckerman himself, the government's advisor on nuclear matters. Air Vice Marshal Derek Stapleton, a former director of defense plans at the Ministry of Defense, who'd retired that month as commandant of the RAF Staff College at Bracknell. Duncan Lewin, a former director of plans at the Admiralty. Lord Beeching, famous for his report on the railroads, a deputy chairman of ICI and director of Lloyd's Bank, and the businessman Sir Charles Dick Troughton, who had become chairman of W.H. Smith the following year. He also suggested Sir William Armstrong, the head of the Home Civil Service, Michael Carey, the second permanent Under Secretary of Defense dealing with the Royal Navy, and Jimmy Carreras, head of Hammer Film Productions, a, quote, great go-getter who Mountbatten had met through the Variety Club. Political suggestions ranged from a former Labour chief whip, Lord Aylestone, and Barbara Castle, to Roy Jenkins, Jim Callaghan, Reginald Maudling, and Alec Home for Foreign Office. Reportedly appropriate because, quote, the people trust him, perhaps alone of the politicians. So, he says he had wanted nothing to do with this quote-unquote coup, yet he seems to have had a whole lot of people at the ready whom he could suggest as leaders for this new government, should a new government need to arise. It seems like an awful lot of thought had gone into something that he wasn't interested in participating in. Anyway, there was history here about Mountbatten's political ambitions. In June 1946, whilst receiving his honorary degree at Oxford, Mountbatten had talked long into the night with Zuckerman about the war, the enormous problems that it had left behind, and about what his future was to be. He wanted to return to the Navy, but other ideas had been mooted, such as his becoming Governor-General of Australia. Zuckerman later wrote in his memoirs, the one job that he felt that he could have done was that of Prime Minister, but that office had been closed to him because of his royal connections. He and Edwina would have known how to handle the settling of ex-servicemen and so on and so on. He talked as though there was nothing he could not do. In December 1947, Ormy Sargent, permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Office, had confided his fears in Dickey's dictatorial ambitions to the journalist, Robert Bruce Lockhart. In 1951, Zuckerman and Mountbatten had met again at a cocktail party given at Admiralty House. He drew me aside, and we had a long talk about many things, but particularly about the sorry state of the country, Zuckerman later wrote. Dickey was immensely worried, and I was not surprised when he said that with his political experience he might have made a better job of leading the country than had Attlee. The 1968 coup was only part of an ongoing battle which continued throughout the 70s between politicians and, in particular, Harold Wilson and the, quote, secret state, largely represented by MI5. In July 1977, Zuckerman had run into Harold Wilson, who had unexpectedly resigned the previous year at the Queen's Jubilee, at Buckingham Palace. Zuckerman was being interviewed the following day by Barry Penrose and Roger Cordier, who was writing a book about the plotting against Wilson. Zuckerman, quote, immediately asked what it was all about. Were they trying to frame Mountbatten? No, it's not Mountbatten thereafter, was the reply, but I knew that there was one section of MI5 which wanted to get at him, Harold Wilson, and Lady Falkender, and one or two others. Courtier and Penrose claimed to have a senior MI5 officer as a source who, with others, had been told that there was something much more substantial behind the story of a possible military takeover than people assumed. They then referred to Cudlip's account of the meeting with Mountbatten and explained that their MI5 informant had told them that the danger of a military takeover had been real. As they saw it, Cudlip had indicated this in his account of the meeting with Mountbatten. Amongst those who had been approached was David Sterling, the founder of the SAS, who in the mid-70s had created an organization called Great Britain 75, recruiting members from the aristocratic clubs in Mayfair, mainly ex-military men, often former SAS members. The plan was simple. Should civil unrest result in the breakdown of normal government operations, they would take over its running. According to the writer Charles Hagum, quote, one who took the plot seriously, perhaps too seriously, was Marcia Williams, Harold Wilson's secretary, who apparently spoke to the press at a later stage, talking of Mountbatten as a prime mover in the plan. She added, Mountbatten had a map on the wall of his office showing how it would be done. Harold and I used to stand in the stateroom at number 10 and work out where they would put the guns. Interesting. There's no doubt that Mountbatten believed in strong leadership, and that a national government might be required, and was vain and flattered to have been approached, and did not immediately reject the overtures, but the evidence that his own role went any further than a few conversations remains hidden. Private Eye was later to claim that Zuckerman had talked Mountbatten out of it, but Alex von Tunzelmann, drawing on private information from Buckingham Palace, has suggested the advice came from elsewhere. It was not Solly Zuckerman who talked Mountbatten out of staging a coup and making himself president of Britain. It was the Queen herself. Mountbatten's relationship with the Queen was a complex one. She had known him since she was a child. He had become a father figure to her after the death of her own father, when she was in her 20s, and she regularly went to stay at Broadlands. She was fond of her husband's uncle, but she had no illusions about him and how he used her to further his own ends. A standing joke in royal circles and army circles was how quickly he would make reference to my niece, the Queen, often using her as an excuse for being late. According to her private secretary, the Queen's attitude was that he was her Uncle Dickie, and she was very, very fond of him, but sometimes she wished he'd shut up. Once she said, I always say yes, 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 yes to Dickie, but I don't listen to him. Mountbatten had resurrected his old friendship with the Duke of Windsor. In February he had dined with him in Paris. We seem to have caught the old spirit, really, even more than in the 1930s, he wrote in his diary, returning again the next month. There was purpose behind this newfound friendship, amidst concerns about the Duke's health and what would happen to his papers and possessions after his death. In May 1972, the Duke had died, and Mountbatten was asked to greet the Duchess at the airport when she accompanied the body back to Britain for burial. She was nervous about meeting the royal family, especially the Queen Mother, but the visit passed smoothly. Mountbatten noted in his diary after he took her to see her husband lying in state in St. George's Chapel, quote, at the end, she stood again looking at the coffin and said in the saddest imaginable voice, he was my entire life. I can't begin to think what I'm going to do without him. He gave up so much for me, and now he's gone. Broadcasting a tribute, Mountbatten, with customary hyperbole, spoke of how the Duke had not just been his best man, but the best friend all my life. Strange, you hadn't talked to him since the 1930s, but okay. Mountbatten now turned his attentions to ensuing the Duke's estate came back to the royal family, suggesting to the Duchess that she left everything in her will to the royal family, or to a charitable foundation in the Duke's name, which he and Prince Charles would administer. He was concerned that she had dismissed her English solicitor, and that her French lawyer, Maitre Suzanne Bloom, was exerting her influence. Mountbatten offered to act as an executor of her will and to find another lawyer connected to the royal family. There were claims by Bloom that two individuals, authorized either by Lord Mountbatten or some other person, acting upon what she alleged to be royal authority, had somehow obtained the keys to the Duke's boxes and confidential filing cabinet and burgled the contents. The contents included the Duke's private correspondence, the documents of divorce from Win Spencer and Ernest Simpson, and a certain amount of the Duchess's personal correspondence. There were also rumors that Mountbatten had arranged for correspondence between the Duke of Windsor and German, Italian, and British fascists to be placed in the royal archives. A friend of the Duchess, Linda Mortimer, visited her shortly afterwards and found her very angry. She said she'd been thinking of leaving most of her things to Prince Charles and some younger members of the royal family, but Mountbatten had been picking up boxes and swords and trinkets, saying, "This belongs to the royal collection." Wallis told Mortimer that she had changed her mind, and Mortimer tried to persuade her, "That's just the way Mountbatten is. He's never been known for his tact." Tactful or not, Mountbatten did save the papers from being sold on open market or given away, and a large amount of material was indeed returned to the royal archives in 3 batches, one on June 15, 1972, the second on December 13, 1972, and the third on July 22, 1977, all of it approved by the Duchess and her advisors. Kenneth Rose, close confidant of the royal family, noted in his diary, quote, "I hear that the Duchess of Windsor has promised to leave Queen Alexandra's jewels back to the Queen, on condition that the Prince of Wales attends her funeral." Mountbatten arranged the deal. Mountbatten enjoyed being the elder statesman of the royal family and had no hesitation offering advice to the Queen and to Philip, advice they sometimes took. It was Mountbatten who had suggested Prince Charles attend Trinity College, Cambridge, Dartmouth, and then spend some time in the Royal Navy. He was close to the whole family, but he'd become even closer to Prince Charles in the early 70s, when the Prince of Wales was posted to Portsmouth and would frequently come to stay at Broadlands, where a room was left permanently made up for him. "It's lovely having him here," Mountbatten wrote in his diary at the beginning of 1972. "We've had so many cozy talks. What a really charming young man he is." In November, Mountbatten had written to him, "I miss you a lot, for there is no one whose company I enjoy more, as I expect you realize." The relationship was reciprocated. "As you may know only too well, to me it has become a second home in so many ways," wrote Charles, after leaving Broadlands for a 6-month cruise. "And no one could have ever had such a splendid honorary grandpapa in the history of avuncular relationship." Mountbatten responded, in a strange response, if you ask me. He said, "I've been thinking of you, far more than I had ever expected to think of a young man. But then, I've got to know you so well, I really miss you very much." I don't think it's weird that he'd say, "I miss you." But I think it's strange that he would throw in this little caveat, "I really miss you. I think about you all the time, way more than I ever thought I'd think about a young man." But anyway, it's because we know each other so well. I don't know that I'd say that, but okay. Not close to his parents. In his Uncle Dickie he found someone to whom he could open up, confess his mistakes and misgivings, and turn for advice, felt John Barrett. That's Mountbatten's secretary. Lord Mountbatten was never short of a few words of advice for anyone, and he particularly enjoyed having the boy, who would one day be king, turning to him for counsel. The royal biographer, Sarah Bradford, thought Mountbatten uniquely placed to instruct the prince with authority and intimacy about the governance of Britain, and to help him intercept the duties and opportunities which faced him. By the time Charles was 23, Mountbatten had become his closest confidant and the greatest single influence of his life. Just as he had allowed Philip, before he married, to use Broadlands to meet young women, so Dickie encouraged Charles to discreetly bring girlfriends, such as Georgiana Russell, now Lady Boothby, to the house. One visitor that spring of 1972 was Lady Jane Wellesley, daughter of the Duke of Wellington, who was to be his girlfriend for the next year. According to the gossip columnist Nigel Dempster, Mountbatten set up a slush fund, administered by a British lawyer through a private bank in Nassau in the Bahamas, to assure that potentially troublesome conquests could be swiftly and handsomely paid for their silence. Certainly 2 and possibly 3 six-figure dollar contracts were signed between December 1974 and July 1979. Now, isn't that an interesting bit of details. A slush fund was set up so that Charles might pay off any troublesome conquests whom he came in contact with. Interesting. Mountbatten's advice to his great-nephew was clear. I believe in a case like yours. The man should sow his wild oats and have as many affairs as he can before settling down. But for a wife, he should choose a suitable, attractive, and sweet-charactered girl before she met anyone else she might fall for. After all, your mummy never seriously thought of anyone else after the Dartmouth encounter, and she was 13. I think it is disturbing for women to have experiences if they have to remain on a pedestal after marriage. Well, he'd speak from experience. Mountbatten was not above pushing his own candidates, including, in 1974, his 17-year-old granddaughter, Amanda Knatchbull, whom he was told Charles was keen on. He drafted how-to-woo letters to Charles, and even going to the lengths of enlisting his favorite goddaughter, the chic Sasha Abercorn, to take Amanda to Paris on a clothes-hunting trip to smarten her up. Amanda and Charles saw much of each other over the next 5 years in London, at Broadlands, and in the Bahamas. Sibylla O'Donnell hosted them twice at her home. I was given strict instructions by Dickie to leave them alone as much as possible, which I did. And then they went to Eleuthera. Dickie tried very hard to get them together. Jonathan Dimbleby revealed in his authorized life of Prince Charles that Amanda had grown fond of Prince Charles, warming to his energy, enthusiasm, his sense of the ridiculous, and his kindness. She admired his immense seriousness, his understanding of the natural world, the fact that he had read Small is Beautiful, the seminal work on the environment by Fritz Schumacher, and that he could quote from Laurens van der Post. She was also touched by his love for her family, and especially for her grandfather. In 1978, when Prince Charles was due to visit India, Mountbatten engineered a visit for himself and tried to include Amanda in the trip. But both her father and Prince Philip objected, worried that Mountbatten's presence might distract from Charles' visit and put Amanda unfairly in the media spotlight. In spite of that, Charles did propose to her, but she gently refused. They liked each other, but they couldn't fall in love, according to Sibylla. There was no chemistry. They'd known each other too long, since they were children. Mountbatten needed to be wanted and loved, to feel that he could act as an intermediary in other people's love affairs. Another relation he tried to matchmake for was his nephew Carl Gustaf, King of Sweden, first with Lady Jane Wellesley, and then Lady Leonora Grosvenor. And when Prince Michael of Kent confided in him, alone of the royal family, that he'd fallen in love with a Catholic divorcee, Marie Christine von Ribnitz, it was Mountbatten who encouraged the match and suggested they marry in Vienna. His desire to involve himself in his family's life was not always welcome. In December 1977, after handing over responsibility for World Atlas Colleges to Prince Charles, the latter wrote to him, I agree to take over as president from you on the understanding, as I saw it, that you wished to cut down on your commitments, etc. From the way you've been tackling things recently, it looks as though you are still going to do too much as patron. I hate having to say this, but I believe in being absolutely honest with you. And when I take over as president, I may easily want to do things in my own particular way, and in a way which could conflict with your ideas. So please don't be surprised if, like other evenings at Broadlands, I disagree with your approach or appear to be awkward and argumentative. I'm only taking a leaf out of your book after all. In April 1979, tensions flared up again, after Mountbatten criticized Charles for breaking short his holiday with the Brabournes, which had caused inconvenience for others. He wrote and said, I thought you were beginning on the downward slope, which wrecked your Uncle David's life and led to his disgraceful abdication and his futile life ever after. Of course, you were legally right. The U.S. Coast Guards could recall a crew from Easter weekend leave if you really wanted them. An officer was on duty and had no claim for the extra 3 days with his fiancée. But how unkind and thoughtless. So typical of how your Uncle David started. When I pointed this out, you flared up, so I knew you'd seen the point. I spent the night worrying whether you would continue on your Uncle David's sad course or take a pull. Charles was shortly, as he now seriously contemplated marriage, to keenly feel the loss of the wise advice of his honorary grandpapa. Well, that's the end of that chapter. So as you can see, Mountbatten was a fiddler. I don't know if he was a fixer, but he was a fiddler. And he liked to have his fingers in all sorts of different things. And he liked to be the center of everyone's world. And I think the book makes clear the point that he wasn't really going to organize and engineer a coup. But I think he liked being involved in the possibility of governmental intrigue. And I think that the possibility of a coup and his name coming up in any sort of important way sort of flattered him. But I don't think that he was foolish enough to actually get involved and get his hands grimy. I think it was just another opportunity for his ego to be stroked. And I think he was willing to have it stroked up until a point, and then, he's like, I'm out. But he loved the fact that his name came up. And I think it's really funny that he is such a matchmaker and wants so very much to be involved in everybody's little world. It's sort of somewhat endearing and also somewhat odd. But what else is this 67-year-old man going to do with his time? The next chapter is entitled Ireland. And I think we all know what that's alluding to. And I think we all know what picture is going to be painted for us there, considering Dickie's demise. Thank you so much to those of you who joined in, and I hope that you enjoyed that chapter. And I'll see you again next Sunday. Bye.